Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Yeah, we're going to talk about weak signal radio communications, high frequency for Bitcoin network messaging. And I'm going to talk about some theory and some motivation about the medium we're going to be broadcasting through. And Elaine will talk about about the protocol and various parameters, signal noise ratio, digital signal processing, and so forth. Okay, what happened? All right, so even though these are called high frequency, that's the official name for this range of frequencies, and shortwave for historical reasons, they're actually much lower frequency and longer waves than the gigahertz that we're used to in our wireless connections. And so forth that we usually connect to the internet to. So the terminology is backwards, but don't let that throw you. The radios in this, I'll talk about the ionosphere and how we're bouncing signals off the ionosphere. And this is very long range stuff. As you can see here, this is an old Voice of America and maritime broadcasting station that communicated with ships in the Pacific and broadcast Voice of America radio programs across the Pacific and so forth. So you can see the range of these things is really long, but one of the ways they do that is they're very high power, like 100 kilowatts. We're going to be very low power, weak signal, 5 kilowatts or less. And the main reason for that is simply to be low profile and to be good citizens of the airwaves, because the people are using them also. And so to bring this to a motivational and theoretical level, we have to, the proofs of secure census tend to rely on this thing called broadcast, which is the sort of ideal communications where every full node, to put it in Bitcoin terms, is broadcasting, talking directly with every other full node. There's no intermediaries. But of course, in the real world, the way Bitcoin works is we have this diffusion process, and real-world consensus implementations such as Bitcoin's fall very far short of provable security for that reason. And this has practical consequences. There are real attacks that are consequence of this fact. One of them described in the Eclipse attacks papers and the attackers directly connected to the victim, and they can partition the victim from the network, delay things, cause various problems. And the internet topology and routing attacks paper that came out this year is even more problematic, because the attacker does not have to be directly connected to you. It's a remote attacker that you're relying on for your routing. These are called autonomous systems. There are things like internet service provider gateways, the Great Firewall of China, phone company routers, and so forth. And these tend to be associated, often correlated with national borders and other political geographical regions for historical reasons. Some phone companies are overtly nationalized. Some of them are just strongly associated, like the company Cable and Wireless is strongly associated with the former British Empire, and so you go to former colonies, you'll find Cable and Wireless still often has a monopoly on their telephone, and thus on their internet routing. Talking about broadcast and trust, there's actually very little in our communication that's fully trustless. I'm going to talk about two ways to broadcast a time signal. One of them, the good old-fashioned clock tower where the bell ringer rings a bell to tell you what time it is, and a pulsar. A pulsar is a rotating neutron star that gives off very powerful beams of radiation, and that radiation impinges the Earth evenly. Anybody with a big radio dish can pick it up. It's not going to discriminate and send one signal to one person and one to another. And the attack, nobody can attack it. There's nobody out there attacking these things. So this is one of the few things that we can actually call fully trustless. A clock tower, on the other hand, it has a bell ringer. The bell ringer could, ring the bell at 2:05 or 2:10 instead of on the hour at 2 o'clock like he's supposed to. So you're systemically trusting it. Everybody in earshot is trusting the bell ringer. But on the other hand, you're not particularly trusting it because they're broadcasting a abstract time, and that it's being what's called isotropically broadcast, being broadcast the same in all directions. So the bell ringer can't ring the bell for one side of the town with one time and the other side of town with the other time. It's one tower and an isotropic broadcast. And so, unfortunately, this is another place where we're trading off security for performance, insofar as the guy at the top there, the big smiling guy, is getting a very high bit rate. He's very close to a narrow beam broadcast. The still somewhat happy person is in the array, but getting a less of a bit rate. But the other people are left out. And in fact, the broadcaster by controlling the direction of this beam can decide who gets the benefit of it and who doesn't. Or at the bottom shows an isotropic broadcast where everybody within range gets to participate, but they're not necessarily going to get a high bit rate. And so one of the things a broadcaster can do with narrow beams is send out one signal in one direction and one in the other, and the people on each side may be oblivious if they don't have any other source of information. Some third party that this gets relayed to could just end up being confused. So to bring this back to the internet and Bitcoin, increase in the diversity of, so the routing attacks paper recommends two things for Bitcoin nodes, especially full nodes. Ensure that they're multi-homed. So have more than one connection to the internet. And have this be routing aware so that you're adding connections. You don't want the same bottleneck appearing in all your paths. You want different ASs. So to illustrate this, here is Alice, who should be not too happy because to get to the internet and to get to the rest of the internet and to the rest of the Bitcoin network, she has to go through either AS1 or AS2. So if both of those blocked the Bitcoin protocol, she'd be out of luck. She couldn't use Bitcoin. But and there could be other problems that are even worse than simple denial of service that the routing attacks paper described that the routing bottlenecks here the ASs could do. So at the bottom, we're going to use radio to basically talk over the heads of the ASs. This will usually be going across a political geographic border because of the correlation I talked about between phone companies and internet topology and traditional political legal systems. And routing over their heads, and you get a much more potentially bigger choice of AS if you can broadcast on your transactions out that way. So we're going to talk about how to do that. So to put this in bullet form, our goals are we want a longer range broadcast than a local mesh network to avoid injection modification problems of mesh relay, and the mesh relay people yourselves that you're depending on causing problems. To allow censorship participation in the network. This is especially good for really short messages that SPV nodes send, so it's particularly favorable for them. And have more diverse multi-homing, the ability, as I showed you, to connect through more than one or two bottlenecks. And so to do this, we're proposing using the Skywave communications, which is based on the ionosphere. So the way the ionosphere works is formed as the sun hits the upper atmosphere of the Earth and near space with ultraviolet radiation. In the case of the F layer, it energizes, it ionizes particles and creates this F layer. And this F layer, in turn, acts like a mirror for certain radio wavelengths of the kind we're going to use. But it also energizes some other layers. So, for example, the D layer gets energized with X-rays, and it acts like fog in front of the mirror. So in the daytime, when the D layer is energized, you tend to get quite a bit less good propagation than you can at night. And there's all sorts of variability and effects in the ionosphere based on the sunspot cycle. Things change, and there's various unpredictable aspects as well. And so the radio community, the two regimes we're interested in, the way they're called by the radio community, is near vertical incidence skywave. So this is the 70-degree angle there. It's nearly vertical. You get a range of about very close in, about 500 or 600 kilometers. The most reliable frequencies are between 40 and 80 meters. So that's what we're targeting. And I'll show a design for an antenna, and it's nearly horizontal or V-shaped. And also medium range, 500 to 2,500 kilometers. And we're going to do the close-in part of that, like out to 900 or 1,000 kilometers, depending on ionospheric conditions and what kind of bit rate we need. And so the loss of going through the D layer is proportional to the angle you go through it. So here we're getting, if you're targeting a range of 320 kilometers, you're getting an average of negative 20 decibels loss. 90 kilometers, 28 decibels of loss, and 1,400 kilometers, 40 decibels. And so this is going to be part of what's called the link budget. You add up all the decibels to see how much loss you get. And if you look at the right-hand side of here, it adds all that up for you for what the ionosphere and the inverse square law and so forth will attenuate. And so to the left is an 80-meter antenna, 4 watts. This is the Voice of America propagation simulation. During the daytime, so this is and with a low spot number. So this is kind of a bad case, well below average scenario. And from South Korea, and if you notice also on the right-hand side at the 120 decibels, that's called the noise floor. That's where the signal decibels equals the noise decibels. And so if you go below the noise floor, say down to 128, negative 128, you need increasingly fancy signal processing and error correction, which Elaine will talk about, and your bit rate goes down. And then vice versa, above the noise floor in the red area, you can get a very high bit rate. And this is a very good conditions. This is nighttime for 40 meters. And you get some very good stuff nearby. There's a little bit of hole there called the skip zone. And if you can go below the noise floor, then you can get some very long ranges going. And so now I'll switch it over to Elaine to talk about the particular protocol and the signal processing and so forth.
Okay, so I'll talk about digital modes over radio and go over some of the design decisions we made and try to explain why we made them. So some of this, since this isn't a signal processing conference, I'll provide a little bit of background. So to begin with, any digital data can be modulated and transmitted over radio waves. Those of you who are old enough to remember dial-up internet, that modem noise you would hear is basically digital data being modulated and turned into sound before it's sent over the telephone wires. So a couple of examples. A few years ago, the hacking group known as Anonymous set up a radio mesh network for encrypted chat messages. And basically they took just text messages and broadcast it over high-frequency radio. And I don't think their mesh network lasted very long. But a more enduring example is something called PSK mail. And PSK mail is a set of mail servers being run all around the world. These servers are connected to radio receivers. So anyone can set up a mail client and broadcast email messages over radio. If you're out in the middle of nowhere or out in the middle of the ocean, Your mail client can send an email message over HF radio, and if it's received by one of these PSK mail servers, they'll relay it to regular email. So this is basically a mail server run over radio. So our work focuses on binary, for our work we chose to focus on binary phase shift keying. Most people here are probably familiar with amplitude modulation and frequency modulation because of AM, FM radio. Phase is the third thing that you can modulate, and it works well with digital data. So we chose binary phase shift keying because it's fairly simple to implement. It has a narrow bandwidth, so we can stay out of other people's way. So in ideal conditions, when we're in a low noise environment, we can use binary phase shift keying without any external error correction. We get about 500 bits per second, and it's about 1,000 hertz bandwidth. In noisier conditions, we can apply convolutional encoding prior to modulation. The convolution encoding allows for forward error correction. And the code that we use has a rate of 1/2, so about 50% of the bits are used for error correction. And then we get an effective data rate of 250 bits per second with the same bandwidth. And with BPSK 500R, we also interleave the data to provide some resilience against burst errors or interference, because that way the error bits won't be clumped together in our code. So for more terrible conditions, there's an option of using multi-frequency shift keying. We didn't actually explore that in depth here in the work to date. It's more resilient to, it has better noise immunity at long distances, but it's a bit harder to tune an antenna to receive the signal. So this is a GNU radio flow graph. It shows a simplified version of the modulator that we used for transmission. It's fairly straightforward. Basically, we take in a stream of bits. We use a symbol set of -1 and 1 because it's binary phase shift keying. We map the symbols to constellation points, then we pass the signal through a root-raised cosine filter. Then each signal initiates a pulse, and it scales the pulse by the value of the symbol. And before it goes into the RRC filter, it passes through a burst shaper to pad the pulses with zeros. Then the output of the modulator gives us a baseband train of shaped pulses that look like either ones or zeros. So if you look at the analog waveform, it will look something like this, where you have shaped pulses representing ones and zeros, and you can multiply this with a carrier wave to generate the actual transmission signal. On the receiver end, the demodulator basically does the same thing except backwards. So those of you who have set up a Blockstream satellite receiver probably have seen something like this, and it works in pretty much the same way. I think the Blockstream satellite uses quadrature amplitude modulation, so they're not only modulating the phase, but also the amplitude to encode 2 bits per symbol. So ours is a little bit simpler. We take the received signal, pass it through a polyphase clock sync, and this has a filter that matches the one used in the transmitter. Then this basically estimates the maximum likelihood times which to sample the signal. And then we get an output sequence of numbers, ones and -1s, and that looks a lot like the symbols that we originally sent. And the CMA equalizes the signal to get a constant modulus or amplitude. And we pass the symbols through a binary slicer, which just converts the output to ones and zeros depending on whether the input was greater than or less than 0. So you can look at the output of the polyphase clock sync. It's the constellation diagram where it should be clustered around -1 and 1, but we sent it through a noisy channel here. And that gets sliced into a sequence of 1s and 0s. So this, we set up a simple loopback test using a couple of 70-centimeter antennas. For the transmitter, we used a HackRF1, and we ran the transmitter off a 21 computer, a 21 Bitcoin computer, and we put this rig together before we realized that the 21 Bitcoin computer was about to turn into a $400 paperweight. But it's still useful later on because we plan to package Bitcoin protocol messages over radio. We have the loopback test, and we added an additional block that injects some Gaussian white noise. And with the added noise, we can estimate the expected bit error rate versus the signal-to-noise ratio. We're actually measuring EB over N0, which is the energy per bit versus the noise power spectral density, which is basically the signal-to-noise ratio normalized to the bandwidth, or the signal-to-noise ratio per bit. So the blue line shows our binary phase shift keying modulation and demodulation with the noise without any error correction, and it performs about as expected. The red line shows binary phase shift keying, but we applied convolutional encoding before modulation for error correction. So you might notice that in really poor conditions, when we have a high bit error rate, the error-corrected results are actually underperform the non-error corrected results, and that's because with a very high bit error rate, the error correction codes sometimes pick the wrong code word and falsely correct for non-errors. So basically, we're going to avoid operating in that region. Okay, so that shows how the data gets modulated and demodulated. That alone isn't super useful. We also have a messaging protocol so that radio stations can actually communicate with each other. And the messaging protocol breaks the data up into frames, and this forms the link layer, which is analogous to TCP/IP on the internet. So each frame just takes a payload and wraps it between a header and a cyclic redundancy check. And the header has just a start a header byte, a version, a stream ID, and the block type or the frame type. So for an outgoing connection request, the version and stream IDs are set to ASCII 0. And then the frame type is a connection request. And the payload also includes a source socket and a destination port. Now, radios don't really have sockets and ports, but these numbers just correspond to service identifiers that match the TCP or UDP port number. So we're assuming that the receiving station recognizes standard IP services and the numbers associated with them. So the payload can vary as a power of 2. For our tests, we went between 8 and 512 bytes. And so what we did was we took standard Bitcoin protocol messages, broke them up, included the headers, and broke them up, and just wrapped them into the payload portion of the frames. So during the data transmission process, both the sender and the receiver maintain a 6-bit counter, and the frame count, or we call it, it's called a block number, but we'll call it a frame count to be less confusing. The sender will keep a counter to keep track of the frame number, and it's a wraparound counter, so the sender will stop sending more frames if the prior 62 or more have not been acknowledged by the receiver. So this is where the acknowledge and the automatic retransmission requests come in. So while the data frames are being sent to the receiver is replying with acknowledge frames, And the acknowledged frame includes the last block number that was acknowledged and the last number that was received and the last number that was correctly received. And then the sender then fills in the gaps and retransmits any frames that were lost or corrupted. And the frame size should adjust dynamically based on the number of retransmission requests. Right now, this is done manually, but it can be automated in the future. And so using this messaging protocol, we ran a bunch of simulations to try to estimate the effective data rate based on prevailing noise conditions. So the y-axis here shows the effective throughput, by which we mean the actual number of useful data bits that get through after accounting or after throwing away the headers and overhead and error correction and accounting for any retransmitted frames. So as you can see, in very good conditions where we have a strong signal-to-noise ratio, we achieve the highest data rate using the largest frame size. So the frame size ranges from 8 to 512 in these tests. And we can get almost 250 bits per second, including the error correction. In slightly noisier conditions, when the signal-to-noise ratio decreases, large frame sizes are no longer usable because the probability of transmitting a large frame without corruption falls to almost zero. And given all the retransmissions of a very large frame, this becomes less useful. So we actually achieve a better data rate using the smallest size frame in noisy conditions. And down to a signal-to-noise ratio of below 0 dB, we can still get about 20 bits per second, which isn't enough to stream Netflix or anything, but it's potentially enough to broadcast some Bitcoin transactions. So this table shows some sample Bitcoin messages and sample message sizes. And we took the data that we got from our simulations to try to evaluate the feasibility of running a radio-connected SPV client. So based on the data rate and throughput numbers we got in the previous slide, you can see straight off that even in very good conditions, when you have a signal-to-noise ratio of 10 dB, it takes well over an hour to receive a 1 megabyte block. So HF radio is probably not a very good solution for running a full node. On the other hand, even at negative 5 dB, you can transmit a 2-output, or you can broadcast a 2-output transaction in less than about 15 seconds. And you can actually perform a simplified payment verification in less than 10 minutes, even under 0 dB conditions. Oops. Okay, so this brings us back to the the signal propagation map. We saw from the previous table that it's feasible to operate an SPV client in between -5 and 0 dB. And if we're assuming a noise floor of about -120 decibel watts, if we're broadcasting from South Korea, we can get a usable signal down to this orange yellowish region. And we can, in terrible conditions, we can just about reach across the border. Oops. I assume that the noise floor is actually lower in North Korea because they don't have a lot going on over there. But in good conditions, we can easily reach from or broadcast from South Korea to Beijing. And Nick will wrap up.
Okay, thanks. I'll close with a couple more slides here. I talked about the correlation between phone companies and, as a result, what were called autonomous systems in the routing attacks paper, and national borders or political regions. And so I did a border simulation of we have two ASs here who are cooperating to block the Bitcoin protocol. And we've got some people who randomly live, they don't want to move a long ways to just to send their Bitcoin messages. So I'm assuming they live in some random place in a 750 kilometer wide strip along this 3,000 kilometer border. So this is like just an imaginary situation that somewhat corresponds to real geographical distances and full node densities. So as we can see here, 4 out of the 5 on each side in this particular case that I recorded have a partner on the other side of the border that they can talk to, but two of them there indicated by the little blue dots are orphans and don't have anybody to talk to. So those two would have to move to get close enough to the border to be able to talk to somebody on the other side. So in this scenario, I'm assuming that stations in the left country, the red country, last only long enough to transmit and confirm a transaction. They're ephemeral, and I'll show you an antenna design for that. And stations in the right country are relatively permanent. They have a somewhat more sturdy antenna design than this one I'm going to show you here. So this one, I went down to the hardware store and the camping store and bought some equipment. So all this is hardware and camping store equipment, except for the radio equipment here, which is the bouncing transformer and the transceiver there at the bottom, and of course the Bitcoin node. So among the hardware store purchases, there's all sorts of different kinds of wires, such as speaker wire, insulated wire. There's other types that can serve as the antenna wire. Coax cable, you can typically have a standard coax output from the transceiver. And the 2-meter mast are simply bookshelf parts for building bookshelves. And the 6-meter mast is a painter pole. It's a painter pole with some extensions that takes it up to 6 meters. And so I'm pretty thumb-fingered, but I was able to figure this out and put it up. So if I can put it up, probably just about anybody who can put up a tent can put it up. But it does take some time, and also the antenna tuning takes a little time. So it's not the most user-friendly thing in the world to do. So among our future work that we're going to do, or we hope gets done, is we want to improve the noise rejection. So we're gonna experiment with multi-frequency shift keying for better performance in low power, long distance links. We're going to try to move our signal noise ratio floor down to 10 decibels below the noise floor. And we're going to do some dynamic or adaptive modulation based on conditions. So the radio signal, as it goes through the ionosphere, actually picks up information about the ionospheric conditions. And people are starting to figure out how to use those to adapt the modulation technique, perhaps even the frequency and some other aspects to optimize the current radio design for the current ionospheric conditions. And we did just kind of a first pass messaging protocol. And so there's some redundancy that we can reduce out of the messaging protocol between the Bitcoin part of it and the radio wrapper. And electrical shortening for antennas, as I showed, this is certainly doable, but it's not the most user-friendly thing in the world to set this up. This is, by the way, portable, but it's also temporary. It won't probably last in a tropical storm wind. So we want to do electrical shortening. You can pick up shortwave stations on a small compact receiver. The technique they use for that is called electrical shortening. And we want to experiment with that. and run long-distance tests with antenna rigs. So we're looking for volunteers who are interested in this system and would like to help. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I think we'll do like one question if anybody has a question that they really want to ask. Okay, we're about to go to break anyway, so maybe you can catch them during the break. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks all.